Han Seojin had never once, in 11 years of collecting, lost an auction he actually wanted to win. He had outbid governments. He had outbid museums with endowments larger than some small country's GDP. He had once, memorably, outbid a man who later turned out to be a genuine European prince, over a set of Joseon-era ceramics neither of them technically needed. So when the gavel came down on Lot 14, a small, unremarkable-looking 19th-century Yoruba bronze figure he'd been quietly, specifically hunting for 8 months, and the auctioneer said, "Sold." To bidder 227, Seojin sat very still in his front row seat and experienced something he hadn't felt since he was 19 years old and lost his first business deal. Genuine, unfamiliar shock. "Who is 227? He asked, not quietly enough, several heads turning. His assistant, a perpetually anxious young man named Ji-hoon, scrolled frantically through the auction house's paddle registry on his tablet. "It just says, a private bidder, sir. No name on the public record. They've paid the registration deposit in full verified funds, but the identity's sealed." "Sealed," Seojin repeated. "You can seal a paddle number?" "Apparently, sir, if you pay an additional privacy fee." Seojin sat back slowly, turning to look toward the back of the room, where the phone and online bidders were typically stationed, though this particular bid, he'd been told, had come from a paddle physically present in the room somewhere behind him. In the crowded rows, he hadn't bothered to survey. Because he never needed to, he simply won. He scanned the room. Nothing obvious. No one looked particularly triumphant. No one was celebrating. Whoever 227 was, they'd apparently already left. "It's a small piece," Ji-hoon offered carefully. "Perhaps not worth it's not about the piece," Seojin said, which wasn't entirely true, though it also wasn't entirely false. The bronze figure genuinely mattered to his collection, a rare, specific piece connected to a set he'd been quietly assembling for a museum wing he intended to open eventually. But more than that, right now, it was the simple, disorienting fact of losing at all. 3 weeks later, it happened again. A rare first edition manuscript, a piece he'd flown in specifically for. Outbid at the exact final moment by the same sealed paddle number, 227. Seojin stood at that auction, mid-transaction, and watched his own bid, a number large enough to make most people in the room audibly gasp, get quietly, calmly exceeded by exactly the minimum increment required. Not aggressively. Not showing off. Just enough. "Sold," to bidder 227. Seojin turned to Ji-hoon, who was already, wisely, bracing for the question. "Find out who this is," Seojin said. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what privacy fee they paid. I want a name." Ji-hoon hesitated. "Sir, with respect, the auction house's legal team was very clear that Ji-hoon." "I'll make some calls," Ji-hoon said quickly. The third time it happened, 6 weeks later, at a different auction house entirely, on the other side of the city, Seojin genuinely began to wonder if he was being deliberately, personally targeted by a rival, an ex, someone with a very specific, very expensive grudge. The item was a small, hand-carved wooden mask, provenance uncertain, but almost certainly looted decades earlier from a village whose descendants Seojin had, quietly, been trying to trace for over a year. He raised his paddle. Bidder 227 raised theirs. He raised again. So did they. The numbers climbed to a level that made even Seojin's own lawyer, seated beside him, visibly stiffen. Then, just as Seojin opened his mouth to bid again, the auctioneer's gavel came down. "Sold," to bidder 227, at Seojin froze. They'd stopped bidding one increment below his absolute limit. Not because they'd run out of money, not because they'd lost their nerve. Because, he realized with sudden, uncomfortable clarity, watching the final number settle on the display screen. They had stopped at exactly the number that would let him walk away, believing he'd simply, narrowly lost, instead of realizing he'd been deliberately, precisely allowed to almost win, and then denied anyway. Whoever bidder 227 was, they weren't simply richer than him, or luckier than him. They were, quite possibly, better at this than he was. And Han Seojin had absolutely no idea who they were, or why, out of every single auction happening in this city, they seemed to want exactly, only, the things he wanted most. Welcome, everyone new here, or back again, either way, I'm glad you're watching tonight. Drop your city or country below, always. Now. I need to tell you this one starts as a mystery, but stick with me. Because the reason Bidder 227 keeps beating him is going to completely surprise you. This isn't a rival, it's not revenge, it's something else entirely, and once you find out, you're going to understand exactly why he can't stop thinking about her. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Okay, let's find out who Bidder 227 actually is. Ji-hoon found the answer 2 weeks later, though found was. He admitted privately, a generous word for what had actually happened, which involved a considerable bribe to a junior employee at the second auction house, and something that skirted uncomfortably close to legally questionable. Her name is Adeze Chukwu, he said, sliding a folder across Seojin's desk with the particular careful reluctance of a man delivering information he suspected his employer wasn't going to like the context of. She's a conservator, sir, works at the National Museum of African Art, contract position, not even full-time staff. Seojin opened the folder, scanning the details with growing, genuine confusion. A modest apartment in a modest part of the city. A part-time teaching position at a community college alongside the museum contract work. A car, an actual, physical car that Ji-hoon's research suggested was 11 years old. This is a mistake, Seojin said. This woman doesn't have the resources to outbid me on a single item, let alone 3. I thought the same thing, sir, Ji-hoon said. So I looked deeper. There's no evidence of hidden wealth, no trust fund, no family money. Her bank records, which I want to stress, sir, I obtained through, means I'd rather not detail Ji-hoon. Her bank records show exactly what you'd expect from someone in her actual, documented financial position. Modest income, modest savings, nothing that explains 6-figure auction bids. Seojin sat back slowly, turning this over. Then how is she winning? That's the part I genuinely don't understand, sir, Ji-hoon admitted. The fund's clear. Every single time. Verified, legitimate, immediately transferable. I don't know where the money is actually coming from, but it's real. Seojin studied the photograph included in the folder, a professional headshot, clearly taken for some museum staff directory, showing a woman with sharp, focused eyes and the particular tired precision of someone who spent her days handling delicate, irreplaceable things with enormous care. I want to see her, he said, in person, not through a file. Sir, I'm not sure there's an auction Thursday, Seojin said, already scanning his own calendar. African Art and Antiquities at the smaller house on the east side. If she's bid on 3 of my targets across 2 different houses, I'd wager she'll be there. He was right. Thursday evening, Seojin sat in the 3rd row, watching the door with an attentiveness he genuinely couldn't remember applying to anything that wasn't a multi-billion-dollar business decision. And finally, 12 minutes before the auction began, watched a woman walk in wearing a simple, slightly worn blazer, take a seat near the back, and pick up paddle number 227. She looked, he thought, entirely unremarkable in every way except one. The moment the first lot was announced, her entire posture sharpened into something focused, alert, and completely, unshakably calm. Lot 8 arrived, a small terracotta figure, provenance disputed, exactly the kind of piece Seojin's collection had been quietly assembling for the past year. He raised his paddle. She raised hers. The bidding climbed steadily, and Seojin found himself, for the first time in this entire strange saga, watching her instead of the auctioneer, the careful, unhurried way she raised her paddle. Never rushed, never emotional, simply present and precise, exactly 1 step ahead of wherever he thought he'd stopped. At his absolute limit. The number he'd privately decided he would not exceed regardless of the piece's significance, he lowered his paddle. She won. Again. But this time, instead of leaving immediately, she remained seated, and Seojin watched, with growing curiosity, as she pulled out her phone and made a brief call, her voice too quiet across the room to make out. though her expression carried something that looked unmistakably like relief. He approached her during the intermission, deciding, after 11 years of never once needing to introduce himself to anyone, that the moment for careful investigation had passed. "Miss Chukwu," he said. She turned, and up close, her sharp eyes carried a wariness that made him immediately, uncomfortably aware of exactly how this must look a stranger, who clearly knew her name. Approaching her at an auction, where she just quietly, repeatedly outmaneuvered him. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've beaten me at 3 auctions," Seojin said. "I got curious." "You had someone investigate me," she corrected, something flat and unamused entering her voice. Seojin, to his own genuine surprise, felt something close to embarrassment. "That's a fair characterization. That's an invasive characterization," Adeze said. "I don't know what you're used to, Mr. Han, but most people don't hire investigators simply because they lost an auction." "Most people don't beat me at auctions," Seojin said. 3 times. On pieces I specifically wanted. Something flickered across her face, not quite amusement, but close to it. "You say that like it's supposed to make me feel bad about it." "It's not a complaint," Seojin said. "It's genuine curiosity. Ms. Chukwu, your financial records don't explain how you're funding these bids." "I'm not asking to be intrusive, you already were," she said, considerably, before this conversation even started. Seojin, entirely unused to being interrupted, corrected, or spoken to with this particular unimpressed directness by anyone outside his own board of directors, found himself, absurdly, fighting something close to a smile. "Fair," he said again. "Let me start over, properly this time. I'm Han Seojin. I collect art, primarily pieces connected to cultures whose histories were disrupted by colonial extraction, and I've been trying to acquire this specific bronze figure for 8 months before you took it from me." "I know what you collect," Adeze said. "I've read about your collection. It's why I've been outbidding you." Seojin blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You collect them," Adeze said, something sharper entering her voice now. "And then what, Mr. Han? They sit in a private wing somewhere, admired by whichever guests you invite to view them?" "I'm building a museum," Seojin said. "Eventually, a proper public one." "Eventually," Adeze repeated, unimpressed. "In the meantime, 3 pieces that belong, morally if not legally, to specific communities who've spent decades trying to get them back, sit in your private collection, decoration for a wealthy man's ego, while I've spent 2 years fighting through auction houses, using every resource I have to make sure at least the ones I can reach actually go home." The intermission bell rang, cutting through the sudden, charged silence between them. "I need to get back to my seat," Adeze said, already turning away. "Wait," Seojin said, something in her explanation landing with far more weight than he expected. "Home? You mean you're not keeping these pieces?" Adeze paused, glancing back at him with an expression that mixed genuine surprise at the question with something more guarded underneath it. "Every single piece I've ever won at auction," she said slowly, "goes directly back to the community museum or cultural institution it was originally taken from. I don't own a single one of them, Mr. Han. I've never kept anything." She walked back to her seat, leaving Seojin standing there, 11 years of confident, unbeaten collecting suddenly completely reframed by 6 sentences from a woman with a modest apartment, an 11-year-old car, and apparently resources he still couldn't fully account for. Seojin didn't return to his own seat for the second half of the auction. He stood at the back of the room instead, watching Adeze bid on 2 more pieces, losing one, winning another. A small carved comb, she immediately carefully wrapped and placed into a padded case she'd brought specifically for the purpose, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely unable to focus on anything except the question she'd raised. "Home?" She says home. He waited for her outside the auction house afterward, standing beside his car with a patience that would have shocked anyone who knew him professionally. "You're still here," Adeze said, emerging with her padded case, clearly unsurprised but not entirely pleased either. I have questions, Seojin said. I gathered that. Where does the money come from? He asked. You've spent, conservatively, close to $400,000 across 3 auctions I know of, and my investigator couldn't find a single legitimate source for it in your financial records. Adeze studied him for a long moment, weighing something. You want the honest answer? Please, a consortium, she said. 6 African cultural institutions, 2 universities, and 1 very determined Nigerian businessman who made his fortune in telecommunications and has spent the last decade of his life quietly trying to repatriate as many looted artifacts as he can locate. I coordinate the acquisitions. I'm the one who actually shows up, does the research, verifies provenance, sits in the auction rooms and bids. The money isn't mine, Mr. Han. It's theirs. I'm simply the person who executes it. Seojin absorbed this, something in the sheer, careful scale of it landing harder than he expected. That's considerably more sophisticated than I assumed. Most people assume considerably less about me than is actually true, Adeze said, something dry in her voice. It's a useful advantage, honestly. Nobody suspects the woman in the 11-year-old car of coordinating a multi-million-dollar repatriation effort. You know about the car, Seojin said, faintly embarrassed all over again. You had someone investigate me, Adeze said flatly. I assumed you'd know things about my finances you had no business knowing. I did some checking of my own, once I realized you were the one behind 3 separate, oddly specific losses of privacy at 2 different auction houses. Seojin, genuinely impressed despite himself, found the corner of his mouth twitching. So you investigated me too. Only after you started it, Adeze said. I don't make a habit of investigating strangers, Mr. Han. I make a habit of trying to bring stolen history home. You happen to be an obstacle. An obstacle, Seojin repeated slowly. That's a fairly significant reframing of 11 years of collecting. Is it inaccurate? Adeze asked, meeting his eyes directly, no cruelty in the question, just genuine, unflinching honesty. You've built one of the most significant private collections of African and Southeast Asian artifacts in the world, Mr. Han. Pieces that, in many cases, were taken through colonization, war, or outright theft decades or centuries ago from communities who never consented to the loss and have spent generations trying to recover what was taken. I don't doubt your intentions are genuinely good. I've read about your planned museum. But intention doesn't return a bronze figure to the village that carved it. Only action does. Seojin stood with that for a long moment, the particular, careful, comfortable justification he'd built around his entire collecting philosophy. I'm preserving these pieces. I'm protecting them. I'll display them properly, eventually suddenly feeling considerably less solid than it had an hour earlier. Can I ask you something? He said finally. You can ask. That bronze figure. The one you outbid me on. 8 months into my search. Where did it actually go? Something in Adeze's expression softened, just slightly. Ile Ife, she said. A small cultural museum near where it was originally taken, in the 1920s, by a British colonial administrator who documented the theft himself, in his own journals, with almost proud detail. The museum director wept when we delivered it. She'd been trying to trace that specific piece for 6 years. Seojin felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar, uncomfortable recalibration of everything he'd assumed about winning and losing over the past 8 weeks. I want to help, he said. Adeze's expression shifted instantly into something more guarded. Help, how? Financially, Seojin said. Resources? I have access to auction house relationships, provenance researchers, legal teams specializing in exactly this kind of repatriation case. I could contribute considerably more than a single businessman's telecommunications fortune. Why? Adeze asked, direct and unsentimental. Because you feel guilty? Because this conversation embarrassed you? Partly, Seojin admitted, deciding, somewhat to his own surprise, that honesty seemed like the only currency this particular woman would actually respect. But also because what you're doing is genuinely, remarkably important, and I have resources sitting mostly idle that could meaningfully accelerate it. Adeze studied him for a long moment, clearly running her own careful calculations. "If I say yes," she said finally, "I need you to understand something clearly. This isn't your project, Mr. Han. You don't get naming rights. You don't get your collection displayed alongside repatriated pieces for good publicity. You don't get to make this about your own reputation. You provide resources. I, and the consortium I work with, decide entirely how they're used." "Agreed," Seojin said, without hesitation. "And," Adeze continued, "I need you to actually mean that agreement, not simply say it to end this conversation gracefully. Because I've had wealthy collectors offer to help before, Mr. Han. It usually turns out they wanted credit, or influence, or a piece of the story for themselves." "I don't need credit," Seojin said. "I have more of that than I know what to do with already." Something in Adeze's careful, guarded expression finally, slightly softened. "All right," she said. "I'll introduce you to the consortium. But Mr. Han, if you disappoint me on this, if this turns out to be exactly the kind of self-serving gesture I'm worried it might be, I will make absolutely certain you never win a single relevant auction again for the rest of your collecting career." "That," Seojin said, genuinely smiling now for the first time since this entire strange saga began, "is possibly the most compelling threat anyone's ever made against me." Adeze studied him for a moment longer, something almost, though not quite, amused crossing her sharp features. "Thursday," she said. "There's a meeting with the consortium's lead researcher. I'll send you the details." She walked toward her car, the 11-year-old car, Seojin noted, with a small, genuine dent in the rear bumper, and Seojin stood there afterward, in the parking lot of an auction house, feeling considerably more unsettled and considerably more interested than he had felt about anything in longer than he could clearly remember. His phone buzzed. "Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon, sir. I hate to interrupt, but the board just received an urgent inquiry from a journalist asking about unusual financial activity connected to several of your recent auction losses. I think someone's been watching this pattern too, and not for good reasons." Seojin read the message twice, something cold cutting through the strange, hopeful warmth of the past hour. "Seojin, what kind of unusual activity? Be specific." "Ji-hoon, the journalist claims to have evidence you deliberately lost several high-profile bids to obscure a money laundering scheme using auction houses as cover. They're implying the sealed bidder is connected to you, sir, that this whole thing is staged." Seojin's jaw tightened. "That's absurd," he said aloud, to no one, standing alone in the parking lot. "Seojin, where is this coming from?" "Ji-hoon, unclear, sir. But the timing is suspicious. This started circulating less than 6 hours after you were seen investigating a private bidder at 2 separate auction houses. I think someone connected to your business rivals may have noticed the pattern and decided to weaponize it before understanding what it actually was." Seojin called Adeze immediately, his stomach tightening as the phone rang. "Miss Chukwu," he said. The moment she answered, "I need to warn you about something." "That sounds ominous," she said, though something careful entered her voice at his tone. "A journalist is preparing a story alleging that our recent auction interactions are part of a money laundering scheme," Seojin said. "I don't know the source yet, but given the timing, I suspect a business rival noticed the pattern of my losses and decided to construct a narrative around it before understanding the actual situation." There was a long silence on the line. "That would be catastrophic," Adeze said finally, her voice tight. "Mr. Han, if journalists start scrutinizing the consortium's funding, if they start asking questions about how the money moves between institutions, universities, and a single field coordinator who shows up at auctions with paddle number 227, that's not just embarrassing. That could expose donor identities who specifically requested anonymity, could jeopardize ongoing negotiations with museums still holding pieces we're trying to recover, could genuinely destroy years of careful, quiet work." "I understand," Seojin said. "I'm already having my legal team look into who's behind this, and preparing a response that protects both of us." "Both of us," Adeze repeated, something sharp entering her voice. "Mr. Han, I appreciate the instinct, but I need to be direct with you. This story exists because of your pattern of behavior, not mine. You're the one who hired an investigator, who showed up at 2 auction houses specifically tracking a sealed bidder. If a journalist noticed that pattern, it's because you created it. Seojin absorbed the fairness of this criticism, even through his own rising anxiety. You're right, he said. I take responsibility for that, but right now, the priority needs to be protecting your work and the consortium's anonymity, regardless of how this started. Agreed, Adeze said, some of the sharpness in her voice giving way to genuine, shared urgency. What do you actually propose? I'm going to get ahead of it, Seojin said, an idea crystallizing rapidly. Before the journalist publishes anything based on speculation, I'll release a controlled statement myself, explaining exactly what's actually happening, not the consortium's internal structure, not donor names, but enough context to eliminate the money laundering narrative entirely. I'll frame it as my own philanthropic pivot toward supporting repatriation efforts, which protects your anonymity while also genuinely being true. You'd do that publicly? Adeze asked, something surprised in her voice. Attach your name to repatriation work, knowing it invites scrutiny of your own existing collection, knowing people will start asking uncomfortable questions about pieces you currently own that might have similarly complicated origins? Seojin considered this seriously, understanding exactly what she was actually asking him. Yes, he said finally, and found, saying it out loud, that he meant it completely. I've spent 11 years building a collection I told myself was protective, preservationist. The past few hours have made it fairly clear that framing was, at minimum, incomplete. If getting ahead of this story means finally, publicly reckoning with that, then I think it's overdue regardless of the current crisis. There was a pause on the line, considering, that's a significant thing to commit to in the middle of a panic, Mr. Han. I'm aware, Seojin said. I'd rather commit to it now, under pressure, than continue avoiding it comfortably for another 11 years. The statement went out that evening, carefully drafted, framing Seojin's recent auction pattern as the beginning of a genuine philanthropic shift toward repatriation efforts, without naming the consortium directly, without exposing Adeze's role specifically, simply establishing enough legitimate context to make the money laundering narrative collapse under its own implausibility. It worked, mostly. The journalist's story, when it eventually ran 2 days later, framed the situation as Billionaire collector's surprising pivot toward repatriation, considerably more favorable than the alternative version that had nearly gone to print. But the exposure came with its own cost. 3 days after the statement, Seojin's phone rang with a number he recognized immediately and had genuinely hoped never to hear from again: Baron Whitmore, a British collector and longtime rival whose own private collection included, Seojin knew with uncomfortable certainty, several pieces with considerably murkier provenance than his own. Seojin, Whitmore said, his voice carrying careful, practiced pleasantness that did nothing to disguise the threat underneath it. I read your rather surprising statement. Repatriation. How progressive of you. Baron, Seojin said carefully. I assume this isn't a social call. I have concerns, Whitmore said, about the precedent you're setting. Several of us in the collecting community have spent decades building our collections carefully, legally, within the frameworks available at the time. Your sudden public conversion suggests, uncomfortably, that the rest of us should be scrutinized similarly. I'd hate for that scrutiny to extend toward your own collection's less flattering acquisitions, Seojin. I recall, for instance, a particular Benin bronze you acquired 6 years ago, under circumstances that might not survive close journalistic examination. Seojin felt something cold settle in his stomach. Are you threatening me, Baron? I'm simply noting, Whitmore said pleasantly, that glass houses tend to shatter rather dramatically when their owners start throwing stones at the broader collecting community. I'd suggest, strongly, that you reconsider whatever direction you're currently heading before this becomes considerably more uncomfortable for both of us. Seojin ended the call and sat with the threat for a long moment, understanding immediately that Whitmore's warning wasn't idle. The Benin bronze in question had, in fact, come with provenance documentation Seojin had, at the time, quietly chosen not to scrutinize too carefully. precisely because doing so might have revealed exactly what he suspected, that the piece had been looted during the notorious 1897 British punitive expedition, sold through an intermediary decades later, with documentation deliberately, carefully vague. He called Adeze immediately. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand it changes the risk calculation considerably." He explained the call from Whitmore, the veiled threat, the specific bronze in question, watching in his mind's eye as every careful justification he'd built around that particular acquisition suddenly, uncomfortably crumbled under scrutiny he'd never actually allowed himself to apply. "You knew," Adeze said slowly, once he'd finished, something careful and disappointed entering her voice. "About the provenance. You suspected it was looted, and you acquired it anyway." "Yes," Seojin admitted, refusing to soften it into something more comfortable. "I told myself, at the time, that I was preserving it properly. That whatever institution eventually received it through my planned museum would be better stewardship than wherever it might otherwise end up. I understand now how thin that justification actually was. So what do you want to do?" Adeze asked. "Whitmore is threatening exposure specifically to silence your public commitment to repatriation. If you back down now, quietly return to your old collecting practices, this entire threat disappears." "I'm not backing down," Seojin said immediately, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "I want to return the bronze. Properly, publicly, before Whitmore or anyone else can use it as leverage against either of us." "That's a significant step," Adeze said carefully. "Returning a piece publicly means acknowledging, formally, that you knowingly acquired looted property. That has real legal exposure, Seojin, potential fines, potential precedent that invites scrutiny of your entire collection, not just this one piece." "I understand the risk," Seojin said, "but Baron Whitmore just tried to use my own hidden shame to silence me into protecting his collection. And men like him will keep using exactly that leverage against anyone who threatens the comfortable status quo, unless someone with real resources actually breaks the pattern publicly, regardless of personal cost." There was a long pause on the line. "You're serious about this," Adeze said finally, something shifting in her voice surprise, and underneath it, something warmer, more genuinely respecting. "Completely," Seojin said. The return of the Benin bronze happened 3 weeks later, coordinated carefully through Adeze's consortium contacts and Seojin's own legal team, structured as a formal, documented repatriation to the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments, with full public acknowledgement of the piece's looted origins and Seojin's own prior, insufficient scrutiny of its provenance. The press coverage was, as expected, considerable, some genuinely admiring of the transparency, some sharply critical of the acknowledgement that he'd knowingly held looted property for 6 years, several outlets specifically noting the unusual, unprecedented nature of a major collector, voluntarily exposing his own past ethical failure rather than quietly correcting it. Baron Whitmore did not call again, though Ji-hoon reported, several weeks later, hearing through industry channels that Whitmore had quietly begun consulting his own legal team about potential provenance concerns within his own collection, apparently deciding that preemptive, quiet correction was preferable to risking the same public reckoning Seojin had just undergone. Through it all, Seojin found himself spending increasing amounts of time with Adeze coordinating the consortium's growing list of acquisitions, sitting through provenance research sessions that ran late into the evening, learning, slowly, the painstaking, careful work behind each piece's eventual journey home. He learned she'd grown up in London, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants, and had first become interested in repatriation work after visiting a museum as a teenager and recognizing, displayed casually behind glass with a placard reading simply, "Yoruba Ceremonial Mask, Nigeria," a piece her own grandmother had described to her as having been in their family for 4 generations before it disappeared during a colonial-era raid. "I spent 2 years trying to trace that specific mask," she told him one evening, both of them reviewing documents in the small, cluttered office she used for consortium work. "I never found it. It's probably sitting in someone's private collection right now, decoration for a dinner party, completely disconnected from every story my grandmother used to tell about it. I'm sorry." Seojin said quietly, understanding, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly how personal this work actually was for her, beyond professional dedication or academic interest. Don't be sorry, Adeze said. Be useful. That's considerably more valuable than sympathy. Seojin found himself increasingly wanting to be exactly that useful. Present. Genuinely invested in work that had nothing to do with his own reputation or collection. Everything to do with something considerably larger and more important than either. He also found himself, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, genuinely falling for a woman who had spent the last 4 months making it abundantly clear she had absolutely no interest in being charmed, courted, or treated as anything other than a colleague in work she cared about more than she'd ever cared about him personally. His phone buzzed late one evening, both of them still working through documentation for an upcoming repatriation case. Ji-hoon, with an update that made Seojin's stomach drop. Ji-hoon, sir. I think you need to see this. Baron Whitmore's legal team just filed a formal complaint against the consortium, alleging their acquisition methods constitute market manipulation. They're naming Adeze Chukwu specifically as the primary target of legal action. Seojin showed Adeze the message immediately, watching her face go carefully, dangerously still as she read it. Market manipulation, she said slowly. He's claiming the consortium's coordinated bidding strategy constitutes illegal collusion. It's retaliation, Seojin said, fury rising fast in his chest. For the bin in bronze. For exposing his own hypocrisy by association. He can't touch me directly anymore without inviting the same scrutiny onto his own collection, so he's going after you instead. He's going after the consortium, Adeze corrected, though her voice carried genuine fear now beneath its careful control. Which means he's going after every institution, every university, every donor connected to it. If this becomes a formal legal proceeding, Seojin, donor anonymity collapses entirely. Every museum director who's carefully worked with us for years becomes publicly exposed, potentially liable themselves. I won't let that happen, Seojin said immediately. You can't simply promise that, Adeze said, some of her fear sharpening into frustration now, directed. Seojin understood, less at him specifically, and more at the sheer, sudden scale of the threat. This isn't a business dispute you can resolve with resources and careful strategy, Seojin. This is my life's work, potentially destroyed by a bitter old man's ego, and I don't have the legal resources to fight this properly. I do, Seojin said quietly. Adeze, let me actually help. Not with vague gestures. With everything legal representation, financial resources. Whatever this fight actually requires. Adeze studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her sharp, tired eyes. This is exactly the kind of dependency I've spent my entire career trying to avoid, she said finally. Relying on a wealthy collector's resources to protect work that's supposed to be about communities reclaiming their own history. Not about billionaires swooping in to save the day. I understand that concern, Seojin said carefully. But right now, Adeze, you're facing a legal threat specifically designed to destroy years of careful work, funded by a man with considerably more resources than your consortium currently has access to. Pride can't fund a legal defense against that kind of attack. Something in Adeze's expression cracked slightly, exhaustion finally breaking through her careful composure. I hate that you're right, she said quietly. Let me help, Seojin said again. Gentler this time. Not because I need credit, not because this makes me feel better about 11 years of collecting I'm still reckoning with. Because this work matters, and I have resources sitting available that can actually protect it. Adeze was quiet for a long moment, weighing something significant. If we do this, she said finally, I need complete transparency from you, going forward, about every provenance question in your remaining collection. Every decision about how resources get deployed in this fight. I can't afford another surprise like the Ben in bronze, not with this much at stake. Completely transparent, Seojin agreed immediately. I promise you that. The legal battle that followed consumed the next 6 weeks. Seojin's legal team, working alongside pro bono counsel Adize, had quietly cultivated relationships with over years of careful, patient work, building a defense that methodically dismantled Whitmore's market manipulation claims, while simultaneously, strategically, exposing the considerable irony of a man with his own extensively documented provenance concerns, attempting to weaponize legal scrutiny against ethical repatriation work. The case was formally dismissed in the 6th week, the judge's ruling noting, with what Seojin suspected was genuine judicial amusement, that coordinated philanthropic acquisition for the express purpose of returning cultural property to its origin communities bears no legal resemblance to market manipulation, regardless of how inconvenient certain collectors may find the practice. Whitmore, humiliated and facing his own mounting provenance scrutiny in the aftermath, quietly withdrew from 3 upcoming auctions and, according to industry gossip Ji-hoon relayed with poorly concealed satisfaction, had begun discreetly negotiating the return of several pieces in his own collection before formal legal action could be brought against him directly. Adize called Seojin the evening the dismissal was formally confirmed, her voice carrying genuine, exhausted relief. "It's over," she said. "Really over, not just temporarily contained." "I'm glad," Seojin said, meaning it completely. There was a pause on the line, comfortable rather than tense, before Adize spoke again. "I need to say something," she said slowly, "and I need you to actually hear it, not just accept it as gratitude." "I'm listening." 6 months ago, she said, "I saw you as an obstacle. A wealthy collector who represented everything wrong with how cultural property gets treated as decoration rather than heritage. I still believe that critique matters generally about collectors like you." She paused. "But you've spent 6 months proving, consistently, through actual sacrifice rather than empty gesture, that you're capable of becoming something different. The Benin bronze, this legal defense, the transparency you've maintained, even when it cost you considerably." She took a breath. "I think I've fallen for you, somewhere in the middle of all that, despite every instinct telling me it was a terrible, complicated idea." Seojin felt something in his chest loosen completely. 6 months of careful, growing feeling finally, mutually acknowledged. "I felt the same way for months," he said quietly. "I was fairly certain you'd never say it first." "I almost didn't," Adize admitted, something like a laugh entering her exhausted voice. "But I think, after everything we've survived these past 6 weeks, pretending otherwise felt considerably more exhausting than just saying it plainly." "Adize," Seojin said, something significant settling into his voice, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know, whatever you decide, it doesn't change my commitment to this work, to the consortium, to any of it. Ask me. Would you consider," he said slowly, "letting this become something more than colleagues who happen to fall for each other during a legal crisis? I understand this complicates things considerably. I understand you've spent your career avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement with the resources you rely on for your work." There was a long silence, considering, before Adize finally answered. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd consider that, carefully, on my own terms, not yours." "That's the only way I'd want it," Seojin said, genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time in weeks. 6 months later, Han Seojin stood in the newly completed East Wing of what had once been planned as his private museum, now formally established as a non-profit repatriation research center, watching a small crowd gather for the opening of an exhibit that existed, deliberately, to display exactly nothing permanently, a rotating showcase documenting pieces successfully returned to their origin communities, photographs and provenance research standing in for objects that had, by design, already gone home. Adize stood beside him, dressed considerably more formally than the blazer he'd first seen her in, though she still, he noted with genuine affection, wore the same 11-year-old car keys clipped to her bag, having flatly refused every attempt he'd made to buy her something newer. "You're staring," she said, without looking away from the crowd. "I'm allowed to stare at my own girlfriend," Seojin said. "You're allowed to stare at your business partner in a professional capacity," Adize corrected, though the corner of her mouth was twitching now, betraying the seriousness of her tone. "Sumi no," Seojin corrected himself internally. Wrong story. Wrong children. Though he found himself smiling at the momentary confusion, thinking briefly of stories he'd heard about other unlikely, complicated loves finding their footing in equally unexpected places. Adaise's actual research assistant, a sharp young graduate student named Funke, approached with a tablet, interrupting his brief distraction. "The Ili Ife Museum director wants to know if you'll say a few words," Funke said. "About the center's next phase of funding." Seojin glanced at Adaeze, who nodded slightly, permission and encouragement both. He stood at the small podium moments later, looking out at a crowd considerably different from the investors and board members he'd once addressed at that fateful gala. Museum directors, researchers, community representatives who'd traveled considerable distances to see, in person, the institution now formally committed to bringing pieces of their history home. "A year ago," he said, "I lost an auction to a stranger, and it genuinely bothered me more than losing should have. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important to understand exactly how petty and small the instinct that started this entire journey actually was." A ripple of gentle, understanding laughter moved through the crowd. "That pettiness led me to investigate a woman who was, in every way that actually mattered, considerably better at ethical collecting than I'd ever been, despite 11 years of considering myself an expert." He glanced toward Adaeze, watching her from the front row with her characteristic sharp, assessing focus. "She taught me that preservation without return isn't actually preservation. It's simply theft with better lighting." The crowd laughed again, warmer this time. "This center exists," Seojin continued, "because I finally understood that the resources I'd spent a career accumulating meant considerably more when deployed toward returning what was taken than toward accumulating more of it. I don't say that as a finished journey. I still have pieces in my personal collection whose provenance I'm actively, uncomfortably researching. I suspect I'll be doing that work for years to come. But I'm doing it, finally, and I'm doing it because someone refused to let me continue comfortably pretending 11 years of collecting was the same thing as stewardship." He stepped away from the podium to genuine, sustained applause, and found Adaeze waiting for him at the edge of the crowd, something warm and openly proud in her expression that he'd learned, over 6 months, was considerably rarer and more valuable than any piece either of them had ever fought over at auction. "That was better than I expected," she said. "High praise. Coming from you," Seojin said. "Don't let it go to your head," Adaeze said, though she was smiling now, genuine and unguarded. "We have 4 more repatriation cases pending this quarter. I need you focused, not basking." "I'm always focused when you're involved," Seojin said. Later that evening, once the opening event had wound down and the last guests had departed, they stood together in the quiet, half-lit exhibit hall, surrounded by photographs of pieces that no longer physically occupied this building, evidence, displayed proudly, of an absence rather than a possession. "Ask me again in 5 years," Adaeze said quietly, echoing, without either of them fully realizing the coincidence, words spoken in an entirely different story, whether taking a chance on the billionaire who couldn't stop losing auctions was actually worth it. "I intend to," Seojin said. "And Adaeze, I have a feeling I already know what your answer's going to be." She didn't correct him. Instead, she reached for his hand, and together, in the quiet, half-empty hall built entirely around the principle of giving things back rather than keeping them, they stood a while longer, watching the last of the evening light fade across photographs of homecomings neither of them had personally witnessed, but both had, in their own complicated, unlikely way, helped make possible. If this story made you think differently about art, ownership, and what it actually means to give something back, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment. Mine's theft with better lighting. Let me know where you're watching from too. Subscribe for more stories about power, love, and the people who teach us to become something better. See you in the next one.